Introduction of visitors. Today we are honoured to remember and pay tribute to a former member of our provincial legislature, the late David Ramsay, who was the MPP for Timiskaming during the 33rd, 34th, 35th and 36th Parliament, and MPP for Timiskaming-Cochrane during the 37th, 38th and 39th Parliaments. Many of Mr. Ramsay's former staff are here with us today in the Speaker's Gallery. Welcome. Also in the Speaker's Gallery is Ms. Judy Marcells, former MPP for the riding of Hamilton West during the 38th Parliament and Chair of the Ontario Association of Former Parliamentarians, and Mr. David Warner, who was the Speaker during the 35th Parliament. Welcome to the Legislative Assembly. We're delighted to have you back. Okay. Government House Leader on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, if you seek it, you'll find unanimous consent to allow members to make statements in remembrance for the late Mr. David Ramsay, with 5 minutes allotted to Her Majesty's Government, 5 minutes allotted to Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, and 5 minutes allotted to the independent members as a group.
Government House Leader is seeking the unanimous consent of the House to allow members to make statements in remembrance of the late David Ramsay, with 5 minutes allotted to Her Majesty's Government, 5 minutes allotted to Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, and 5 minutes allotted to the independents as a group. Agreed? Agreed. Agreed. Pleased to recognize the member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to stand today to pay tribute to the late David Ramsay, MPP for Timiskaming and then Timiskaming-Cochrane from 1985 until 2011. I had the pleasure of working with David as his critic when he was Minister of Natural Resources and Minister of Aboriginal Affairs between 2003 and 2007. In my experience, David was a true parliamentarian. I found him approachable and willing to discuss issues when I was his critic, and I know I'm not the only one. Former MPP Norm Sterling said the same thing when he paid tribute to David upon his retirement. David was born in Australia, adopted and moved to Canada at a year old. He lived in Oakville, attended Concordia University in Montreal, and then moved to a farm near New Liskeard with his bride, Kathy. Elected in 1985, David was an MPP for 26 years and served as minister in both the Peterson and McGuinty governments. And I'm sure others will talk more about his political accomplishments. David's legacy is unique because he's the only member of this chamber to have successfully been re-elected a number of times after having crossed the floor. I can only think of one person who was more successful after crossing the floor, and that would be Winston Churchill. In the British Parliament, crossing the floor is referred to as ratting. Churchill is quoted as saying, "Anyone can rat, but it takes a special person to re-rat." I would say it takes a special person to get re-elected after ratting. David was first elected in 1985 as an NDP, but 17 months later joined the Liberal Party. In preparing for this tribute, I called the former member with the longest memory I can think of, and that is Sean Conway. In 1986, Sean was Minister of Education in the Peterson government. He told me that when David was thinking about crossing the floor, he asked for Sean's advice. Sean strongly recommended against crossing the floor, likely that he'd lose in the next election and many other concerns. He suggested if he really wanted to do it, he should make a statement of principle, then sit as an independent, and then approach the riding association and then later the entire Liberal caucus. David did not follow this advice. The next week he crossed the floor and joined the Liberals. Shortly after this, Sean, who was exhausted after a year of being Minister of Education in the Peterson government, went on a holiday to London, England, where he had a memorable lunch at Canada House with former Conservative ministers Roy McMurtry and Tom Wells. Roy was then the Canadian High Commissioner to England. Well, midway through the lunch, Sean received an angry phone call from the NDP leader and future Premier, Bob Rae, who accused Sean of stealing his member, luring him to join the government. Rae had learned that Sean was the last person to speak to David and was not happy. Well, crossing the floor didn't affect David's electoral success. In his first election as an NDP, David won by a little more than 800 votes. In the next election, running as a Liberal, David won by some 4,300 votes, and he went on to win 5 more elections after that. And when David retired, the riding went back to the NDP. To me, that proves that the voters in Timiskaming-Cochrane were voting for David Ramsay, not for the party. I can't think of a bigger compliment than to say he was elected because he was liked and trusted by the people in the riding. I'm not done yet. I can do more than use my 5 minutes. So, David was also liked and trusted by his staff. David treated his staff like a second family. A number of his former staff are here today. Joining us here today are Jeanette Albert, who worked for David for many years, Kevin McGuire, who worked for him both the Peterson and McGuinty governments, Amanda McKenzie, Amy Swanson, Anne-Marie Flanagan, Babak Abazada, Derek Luke, Eric Bianchini, Hillary Thatcher, Jennifer Tuck, James Harvey, and Melissa Wilson. Welcome to Queen's Park. And I hope I haven't missed anyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us here today. And I understand you will be gathering at David's favourite spot, Swiss Chalet, later to share fond memories. I reached out to Craig Hewson, who was Senior Policy Advisor for David at Natural Resources. Craig is overseas in Dubai, so he can't be here today, although he did text me to say he's watching from Dubai. Apparently, on the many road trips that a Minister of Natural Resources must take, Minister Ramsay seemed to be able to locate the local Dairy Queen in every community, and that was before GPS. And as those of us who have large ridings will probably understand, it seems that David was known to drive a little over the speed limit. But when his staff was driving, he was a little more conscious of the speedometer. Craig told me that on an occasion where he was driving Minister Ramsay, MPP Mike Brown, and an OPP officer, David looked at the speedometer and very calmly told Craig that if he had an accident, he would cause 2 by-elections and a police funeral. Craig says he slowed down after that. Of course, like all of us, David had a family and interests outside of politics. David was a passionate sailor. He and Kathy kept a boat on Manitoulin Island and loved to sail Georgian Bay and the North Channel. As we all know, there are parts of Ontario where the cellular coverage isn't great, including around the North Channel, and a Cabinet Minister does need to be able to check emails and get phone calls periodically. I understand that in order to get cellular service, David was known to climb a tree with his phone to return calls, leaving Kathy a little concerned about the dangers of the job. In 2011, I remember asking David what he was going to do with his retirement, and he told me of their plans to sail to the Bahamas, something I understand they did and very much enjoyed. After David retired, he and Kathy moved to Nova Scotia to be close to children and grandchildren, and I'm sure it's only a coincidence that it is another great sailing destination. I'm glad that David and Kathy got to enjoy more time sailing and more time with their family after his retirement. On behalf of the government members, I want to thank David's family for the sacrifices that allowed David to serve in this place for so many years. Our thoughts are with his wife, Kathy, their children, Michael, Danielle, and Aaron, and grandchildren, Isaac, Cameron, Riley, and Abby, and with David's friends, including, of course, his former staff who are here with us today. Thank you.
Next, I'll recognize the member for Timiskaming-Cochrane.
Thank you, Speaker. It's an incredible honour today to pay tribute to the predecessor of the seat of Timiskaming-Cochrane, Mr. David Ramsay, on behalf of the official opposition. David was, in his time, Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Corrections, Agriculture and Food, and Natural Resources. It's without question, he was the longest-serving member of any riding that held the name Timiskaming in it, and the only one to do it from 2 parties. And for that, I'd like to go back a little bit in history to talk about David in the riding. So if you go back to 1985, we, and I had the privilege of doing a tribute for him as well. We had Mr. Ed Havrot as our MPP, and Ed shot from the hip. And David was different. David was actually, I would say, a calming influence. And we thought, you know, it's going to be smooth sailing from here on in. And a year after his election, boom, he switched parties. and to switch from the orange team to the red team was quite something. Now, it didn't bother me that much because I was blue back then. I have to say. But in the research package, there was a time when David Ramsay was blue as well. But the fact that David crossed the floor, and it was incredibly tough, and as I was thinking about what to say today, it had to be incredibly tough. Not just to cross the floor here, but to go home to the people who supported you on one side, and it was incredibly tough. And he survived it. Not only survived it, but he excelled in it. He increased people's confidence in him. And that is a true testament to his personality. I really got to know David during one of our biggest issues in Timiskaming, and that was during the Adams Mine fight. And a fight it was, the area was divided, and David was in the center of it. And if one thing that David Ramsay was excelled at, the only thing maybe he could have been better at than a member for Provincial Parliament is a poker player. Because he always he did keep some of his feelings close to his chest. It frustrated me sometimes because we didn't always agree. But I think we respected each other. And just before the 2003 election, the Liberals promised to stop Adams Mine. And for a while, David Ramsay and I were almost friends. and after the election, when that didn't happen right away, David, one time, we were on a plane traveling to Toronto, and he poked me in the shoulder. He says, "John, I'd just like to remind you that politics is a team sport." Okay, I could live with that. But in 2007, I ended up running against David Ramsay. Not because, and for the NDP, which I'm proud to be a member, but not actually to become an MPP. When the Adams Mine Lake Act was passed, I was also being sued, and no one did anything about that. And I was going broke. So we decided to run for the NDP to bring some light to that issue, and hopefully the government or somebody would tell the company who was suing me to drop the lawsuit. And that happened. And in that campaign, David Ramsay was 100 times the candidate that I was. Unbelievable. He could talk to a 5-year-old or to a captain of industry and treat them all with the same level of respect, with the same level of dignity. They all learned something from him. And I'd just like to clarify something. We came within 634 votes of taking out David Ramsay. And there was no one more surprised. No, there's one person more surprised than David Ramsay. That was me. Obviously. But I would just like to take a minute to say why and how politics is local and politics is. So David Ramsay was the Minister of Natural Resources And that spring, the blueberries froze in May. When the blueberries freeze in May, and the election is October, I believe, 7th, the black bears are really hungry by around September. And there was black bears everywhere. So when you'd go to knock on the door, two things you'd look for. First, a black bear, just in case. And second, damage from black bears. And you would go to the door and knock, and this is a testament to David Ramsay. Almost every door, they'd open, say, I'm John Vanthof from the NDP, and they would say, we are solid David Ramsay supporters. They didn't say Liberal supporters, they said David Ramsay supporters. And I said, yeah, great. I've worked with him. He's a great guy. But do you recall that the McGuinty government promised that they were going to clean up the nuisance bear problem? How's that working out for you? and David Ramsay had really, there was nothing he could do about that. And I want to say that publicly because he was a great representative. And I know I'm going over time, but I'd like to thank very much for many of his staff members for being here. I also have a staff member who worked for David Ramsay, Darlene Bowen. And she was still friends with David when he passed. And she also told me that she worked for him for 2 years, and she drove with him to a lot of events, but she only let him drive once. Once was enough. But he treated everyone. During that campaign, I made lots of mistakes. I was young. I wasn't smooth. I'm still not smooth. And there's lots of times where his experience, his skill, his knowledge, he could have done many knockout blows. And he didn't. And he was always gracious. So I'd like to take this opportunity. I've always regretted I've never had the opportunity to tell him in person. The last time I talked to David Ramsay, or last time I saw David Ramsay, was about 2 years after I was elected. And we were going through, it was the McGuinty minority government, and it was a really tough time. And we were at an event, and somebody walked up and said, Vanthof, how does it feel to be the MPP? And I looked, I said, you know what, in the last couple of years, I've developed a whole new level of respect for David Ramsay. And he was a couple seats over, and as I walked out, and we nodded each other and smiled. And I've always regretted that I've never been able to shake his hand before he passed. So I'd like to thank his staff, but very much thank his family. And to David, may you have fair winds and following seas. On behalf of the people, Timiskaming-Cochrane. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The member for Guelph.
Thank you, Speaker. It's an honour today to rise to pay tribute to the former late MPP David Ramsay. I'm going to be brief because I want the people who actually served with Mr. Ramsay to have more time. But I wanted to make one critical point that I admire so much about David Ramsay, was that he had the courage of his convictions and the personality to win over his critics. And if there was ever a controversy in Northern Ontario, the member from Timiskaming-Cochrane nailed it. If there was ever a Minister of Natural Resources who was going to make Northerners happy, would have gotten rid of the spring bear hunt, and Mr. Ramsay didn't do that. And I can tell you, as one of those dreaded Southern environmentalists who fought so hard against the Adams Mine landfill, it was such a joy to have a Northern Minister of Natural Resources bring in the Adams Mine Lake Act in 2004. And so I want to say thank you to MPP Ramsay's family, friends, and colleagues for sharing him with us, because he has made Ontario a better place to live. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Ottawa South.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And it's truly a privilege and an honour to say a few words about David James Ramsay, member for Provincial Parliament for Timiskaming-Cochrane from 1985 to 2011. And a lot of the words that you're going to hear me speak today come from people in the gallery, his colleagues outside the legislature. And so I hope they truly reflect how people felt for David, which I think is David's lasting and enduring legacy. First elected in 1985 as an NDP member, and then becoming a Liberal about a year later, he then won 6 successive elections. That's pretty incredible. And it's a testament to his deep dedication to the people of Timiskaming-Cochrane and the things that were important to them. And here's what he said when he retired in 2011. You know, I never fail to realize how down on a lot of people's luck that they are every day. And they come in, and sometimes we can make a difference in their lives, and I think in the end, that will be the enduring thing. You notice that he said we. David never used I a lot. He understood it was a team sport, whether it was with his colleagues or with the staff. You know, for 26 years, David held many positions of responsibility. In caucus, as a Minister of the Crown, he handled difficult issues with care and common sense. Janelle Albert, who worked with him for a very long time, said this about David. David took his work seriously and always tried to do his best to do what was right. And David was a listener. That's what was a big part of his success. He truly listened. I understand that the ministry David liked best was the Ministry of Natural Resources because it meant so much to his community and to the North. My first interaction with David was when he was Minister of Natural Resources and I was working for Premier McGuinty in Ottawa. And the member from Nepean will remember this. At the time, a family in Ottawa South took in an orphan baby deer into their home and then kept it in captivity as a pet. So as the story goes, Bam Bam the deer was rescued by about a dozen Ottawa police and conservation officers who were, let's just say, very well armed. And so the ensuing mess was incredible. It was all over the news, free Bam Bam the deer, and quite frankly, the phones to the constituency office rang for 4 days straight. There was never a line open. So there's a lot more detail on this, and the member from Nepean will share the story some other time. It's a really crazy story. It was a really difficult situation because people were truly concerned and upset, as often people are in the cases of animal welfare. But you can't just keep a baby deer. That's not the way things work. Here's the thing. David and his staff, they found a solution for which I am forever grateful. And there are many other stories, and they can recount them, like Mike the Moose, flying stories, other crazy animal wildlife stories. The truth is the Ministry of Natural Resources, it's a hard ministry. It requires political skill to balance the many competing interests that are there. And with the skill of a sailor who always understood where the prevailing winds were coming from, David handled all those files very deftly. He was well respected by his colleagues. Premier McGuinty said this, David brought good humour and goodwill and good insights to Queen's Park every day. David was equally at home and humble, whether serving Ontarians as a Minister of the Crown or helping his constituents. He never forgot where he came from or what he was sent to do. Monique Smith said this, David always had a sparkle in his eye. He was a lovely colleague and friend. David had a great sense of humor. There is a story floating about that David met Bob Rae after Bob became a Liberal, which was some 20 years after David had left the NDP. And his first comment to him was, welcome aboard. David really liked people. He always displayed a genuine interest. And as I said before, he listened. I think that he understood the most important things in life are your relationships with others. He built a lifelong relationship with the staff who work with him here at Queen's Park and in the riding. Some of them are in the gallery today. Kevin McGuire, his former chief of staff, said David would tell him to not book anything at lunchtime so he could sit down and have lunch with the staff. He treated the staff like family. If someone was having a difficult time, he always made himself available. He loved ice cream and would drive by a Dairy Queen apparently anytime he could. I can relate to that. He'd buy a container of Haagen-Dazs ice cream and just bring a spoon. I can relate to that too, yeah. He also loved Swiss Chalet, or Chalet Barbecue, as they told me he called it. And I know that his staff are going to go out and have a lunch in his honor today. And that's just great. So the most important thing is that David was a loving husband, father, and grandfather. He was always in a rush to get home to his family, and as you heard, he got quite a few speeding tickets as a result. So we all know that as members, our responsibilities steal time away from our families. David understood this. It's not easy, especially on our families. We give up a lot. Our families give up even more. So thank you to his wife, Kathy, daughters Danielle, Karen, son Michael, his grandchildren Isaac, Cameron, Riley, and Abby. Thank you for sharing him with us and the people of Ontario. 26 years is an incredible legacy of public service. David brought to that service dedication, common sense, and a sense of humor, and most importantly, a genuine interest in the people around him. And it's been a real honor to pay tribute to him. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you to the members for their eloquent tributes. Together we give thanks for the life and public service of David Ramsay.